I want to shift the discussion slightly to talk about the discipline of art history. And one of the questions that came to mind as I was listening to you talk about the image was, why not visual culture instead of art history? You and I were both graduate students in the United States at a moment when the question of the discipline of visual culture was sort of on the table, and whether or not art history needed to become more like visual culture, or learn things from visual culture, or at least how would one recognize the difference between art history and visual culture. And that's a critique that never particularly interested me. But what I'm struck by, as somebody who identifies herself as an art historian and who did a PhD in art history and was very much influenced by a particular school of the history of art, sort of theoretically inflected Marxist art history, is that the discussion of contemporary art by people who work in contemporary art, by curators, by critics, people who identify themselves as curators and critics and so forth, seems to be able to draw from different kinds of sources, theoretical, art historical, sources out of visual culture. And artists seem to be very aware of those sources in a way that maybe the discipline of art history resists. Or maybe that's because I'm outside of the U.S. and American, the English, American, and German context of art history. My sense of the way that the discipline hasn't been keeping up with what's been going on either in the curatorial world, in the institutional world, outside of the academy, or the critical world, or and most importantly, or the artistic world. In other words, contemporary art history doesn't have the same tools, or isn't developing the same tools for critiquing the image that maybe artists are, or curators are. And I wonder, sort of as a follow-up to that point, which you can certainly take issue with, is whether or not there is a political urgency to doing art history in the way that it maybe felt 20 years ago, when before the social history of art, for example, which I think, or the other tendency being the very critical position of the scholars that are involved with the journal October, before those two strands seem to have become so institutionalized that criticality doesn't anymore feel like the main impulse behind them, but rather a kind of self-historicization, to my mind, from the outside. So do you feel, I mean, as an art historian, do you feel that the work that you're doing on contemporary art, are you interested in doing a political art history, or is that even a question? Or do you feel like I guess, I mean, in another way to put it, I guess, is there's this idea, I think, that I've heard expressed over the past year or so, that politics has migrated into the artistic field and out of the academy, right? Or out of art history. And I've heard this said by art historians and by artists and by art critics, in particular in the context of a seminar that I participated in at the NHL last year on the social history of art and the artistic history of the social.
I don't know who was there, but...
So, yeah, my question is there any sort of political impulse left in art history? If it is it in the field of contemporary art, or the study of contemporary art?
Yeah, again, it's an enormous question with I see many parts,
Tentacular.
Many potential approaches to addressing the substance of the question. It's true that visual culture and art history had a historical argument, I think, in the 80s and 90s. In the early 90s, in a way, it came to a head, at least in my experience, in terms of a special issue of October magazine that was dedicated to visual culture.
The visual culture question there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I remember discussions about this at the time. And for me, I never I never felt so invested in this issue. I never felt like it affected my work very much, and I never felt protective of art history as a discipline because I was trained in art history. Partly because and I think it's true in a way the point that you made about that generation of art historians and critics associated with October entering into becoming institutionalized in a certain way. I think there's some truth to that, and coming with that, maybe, perhaps, for someone like Rosalind Krauss, is a protective relation, a rediscovery of art history, a re-evaluation of art history as a discipline, and to protect the borders of the skill set that are grouped within that discipline. I distinctly remember her saying that visual culture represented the de-skilling of art history. I'd never thought that. I always thought that her work, Hal Foster's work, Douglas Crimp's work, Craig Owen's work, other figures associated with October, Benjamin Buchloh, that their work drew on the resources of visual culture, and the same resources that people in visual culture would draw on, broadly critical theory, Frankfurt School theory, Marxist theory, political theory, post-colonial theory. So I never completely understood or accepted these disciplinary debates. I found them to be petty, and there's a saying that the reason why academic fights are so virulent is because there's so little to fight for. And I think there's some truth to that. Like for me, it's just simply never been important. And if the work is good, if it's a good analysis, I don't care where it comes from or who writes it. And I like the fact that people like Ron Sierre, for example, write about art, even though they're not trained. He's not trained as an art historian, and his work could be criticized on that basis. But what he does have to say, or what many curators have to say, who haven't been trained as art historians, can be very, rich and substantive and compelling and worth engaging with. So, in a way, maybe I won't go into that, but it's in a way, moving to the UK for me, when I moved there in 2005, I entered a context where, in some ways, visual culture and the whole relation to the status of theory and cultural studies in the UK is still ongoing. It's still very strong, and there's still, unfortunately, I think, sometimes feelings of resentment or resistance toward art history, and perhaps sometimes in the other direction. But I think it's unfortunate, for me, I feel when these things come up, I feel completely divorced from it and uninvested in it. In terms of the other question, the other part of your question that I remember that's very important, I think, is this issue of has politics migrated from art history, and that doesn't resonate with my experience at all. I think I know perhaps where but one always has to have a complicated understanding of art history, because I'm sure, as you know, art history it can mean many things, and it can be at times the most deadening, boring, irrelevant practice of writing and lecturing, or it can be completely urgent and necessary and compelling and at least that's the kind of art history that I'm interested in. And in that light, I don't see much of a difference between art history and criticism. My work increasingly has been about the history of the present, in a way, and investing contemporary practice with historical consciousness, which is one reason I think that I'm drawn to some artists, like, for example, the Autolith group, who come to their work with a very important historical consciousness. So, in that, one doesn't have to be an art historian to do that work, but it's useful in some ways. But for me, I think maybe I'm missing it because this is what I think my work is all about. But for me, part of my struggle to be what I am, to practice the kind of, to write the kind of work that I do, is to draw art and politics into an explicit connection. You know, whether that's art history or not is not such an important question for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's been accepted as such in any case. Because your work has been accepted as such in any case as art history. Yeah. Given your institutional.
And I use, and certainly one, like for me, I use that is an opportunistic, sometimes an opportunistic decision, because I think we need to, because often let's not over-evaluate the significance and resonance of our discourse, because we're often talking within very small groups,
sure,
and I think there's no reason to limit what we say to specific contexts, and certainly that's been the ladder that I've used to climb up and to diffuse my own writings, because I have access to those, because of my training, I have access to those platforms. Mm-hmm. But it's one, at least I feel, increasingly it's important to try to diversify. So that's something I've been thinking about in terms of my own work, how to break out of those institutionalized channels, mm-hmm. which are very limiting. And again, the theorist that comes mostly to mind when I say these words is Rancière and his, the politics of redistributing the sensible. That's I think that's such an important phrase, and it's directly relevant to these kind of questions. Mm. To breaking down who can talk about art, because that kind of defensive question was that proprietary posing is what I recall in relation to these debates between art history and visual culture then. Very petty feuds about who has the authority to say what about mm-hmm. art.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember this as well throughout all of my studies when I was actually doing art history in an art department, which is a very different experience than doing art history in an art history department. Mm-hmm. Because in an art department, we're confronted with practicing artists every day, right. And the conversations that you have with practicing artists and the way in which they actually talk about art history when you're sharing classroom space together is very interesting. And those same issues came up all the time. Yeah. Who has the legitimate position to talk about what? Yeah. And so when you're, as an art historian, forced